Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for the history of modern Asia. Today we are going to talk about the CCP, also known as the Chinese Communist Party. So let's get to it. By the 1930s, China is at war on two fronts. On the one hand, the GMT, or the Kuomintang, the nationalist party of Chiang Kai-shek, is fighting the Japanese, who have invaded Manchuria, and by 1937 will have invaded China proper. But the war with Japan is just one of the fights that China is in the midst of. The Republic of China has to defeat not just the Japanese, but actually several remaining warlords, as well as the Chinese communists. Some argue that the GMT should ally itself with the communists in order to defeat the greater enemy, Japan. But Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, disagreed. When Chiang was asked about an alliance with the communists, he said, "The Japanese are a disease of the skin. The communists are a disease of the heart." Essentially, what Chiang is saying here is that he will not tolerate a second government within China. But who were the communists? To understand the roots of the Chinese Communist Party, we need to look back at the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution broke out in October of 1917. And by the end of the year, the Russian communists, aka the Bolsheviks, were in power. In 1920, the Soviet government sent representatives to China to investigate if a similar revolution was possible there. The May 4th movement had attracted the passion of many young people in China, eager for reform. So did the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. One of the young men who quickly rose to the leadership was a young man named Mao Zedong. Mao got his start by organizing a communist group in the province of Hunan in southeastern China. The CCP, or Chinese Communist Party, were very good at attracting the support of industrial workers as well as young students. Largely, this was because they were also good at mobilizing anti-foreign and anti-imperialist sentiments within China. This is all going to come to a head on May 30th, 1925, when a group of industrial workers and students will assemble to protest against the British, who basically ruled Shanghai as a colony. A British official ordered his guards to disperse the crowd. The guards will fire, and 11 protesters will lay dead. 20 more were wounded. Now, I want to make a connection here between this incident, which becomes known as the May 30th incident, and other things we have seen before. What do we have in the May 30th incident? But we have young protesters who are angry about Western imperialism. This is the same motivation that drove both the Boxer Rebellion and the May 4th movement. And even if we look at Chinese events today, we will see that the youth in China can sometimes be a very powerful force for protest. Another violent incident in the early history of the Chinese Communist Party will occur in March of 1927, when the Kuomintang will launch a purge against the CCP, killing thousands in the city of Shanghai. Mao and a few others will flee the violence to the mountains of Xinjiang, which lie to the south and the west of Shanghai. Yet despite the fact that Mao survives, as do a number of his colleagues, the Communist Party in China has been severely wounded. While in the Xinjiang Mountains, Mao will formulate his communist ideology. Specifically, he will examine the class system in China. Ultimately, in a book he'll title An Analysis of the Classes in Chinese Society, he argues that China's rural communities really consist of 5 distinct classes. At the bottom of this society, the most powerless group were the landless rural peasants, who lived only on what tiny wages they could make as field hands or working other small, odd jobs. Just above the landless rural peasants was a class that Mao called the poor peasants. Now, poor peasants owned some land, but they didn't have enough to support themselves or their families. Thus, they had to rent extra land from a landlord. This left them open to exploitation by the landlord, who could charge them whatever he wanted for that land. Next in Mao's hierarchy were a group called the middle peasants. Middle peasants owned enough land to support themselves. Thus, they were able to maintain their independence from the landlords. Above the middle peasants were the rich peasants, who owned enough land to support themselves and to rent out land to poor peasants. Thus, this made them one of the exploiting classes, or in other words, one of the enemies of the people in Mao's configuration. At the top of this hierarchy were the landlords. And the landlords were probably the most villainous of all of the classes within Mao's way of thinking. That's because the landlords didn't actually farm their land. They owned enough land that they were able to rent it out to the poor peasants, or they were able to rent it out to the poor peasants. And this is how they made their money. Or they made their money by lending out money. In either case, they would charge either too high a rent or they would exploit the poor through high interest rates. Thus, these were the true villains in Mao's way of looking at Chinese society. With this ideology in mind, Mao will begin putting into operation a land confiscation policy within the region controlled by his Communist Party. Essentially, Mao will begin to confiscate the lands and the work animals and the equipment of those who were deemed to be rich peasants or landlords. This equipment or this land or these animals would then be redistributed to the poor peasants. Now, of course, this didn't go smoothly. The rich peasants and the landlords really resisted Mao's efforts. However, the policy did win the communists some support among the very poor. He will need every supporter he can find. That's because between 1930 and 1934, Chiang Kai-shek will launch another effort to exterminate the communists within China. There will be 5 separate major expeditions launched against communist strongholds, mostly in the southern part of the country. By 1935, Mao and his followers will realize that they can no longer hold out in the Xinjiang Mountains. So therefore, about 90,000 communists will retreat from their mountain stronghold and go on a long march of about 6,000 miles in about 370 days. The Long March, as it is now known, has become a legendary feat in communist mythology. The communists today speak of this as being a miraculous event under which Mao saved the communist revolution in its most dire days. However, the Long March will be very hard on the Communist Party. Only 40,000 of the 90,000 that set off in the Long March will survive. Nevertheless, the important thing here is the communists will survive as a fighting force. So where are we in 1935? By 1935, Japan is now fully in control of Manchuria, or as they call it, Manchukuo. Now, Chiang Kai-shek has had a lot of success in destroying the landlords who had, divided China for so many decades. He has also sent the communists on the run. I mean, the Long March is really a long retreat. The communist position is really quite desperate. The problem, however, is that the CCP has not been destroyed. They remain a threat. And so Chiang will have a choice in 1935. He could either concentrate all of his forces on defeating the CCP and then risk losing to the Japanese, or he could unite with the CCP and fight the foreign invader. We'll discuss in the next lecture what he chooses to do.